Lomochrome turquoise. It's an experimental, I mean, I'm pretty sure you know about it, and I reckon if you've searched for it, this is one of the videos you found. It's an experimental color shifting film stock by Lomography, and yeah, they've done some pretty cool things. I didn't shoot it in this camera. I shot this roll actually in April in my Canon new f1 with the 50mm f1.8 lens, the Canon lens. This is just what I'm shooting with now. It's my dad's old Pentax. So let me know in the comments, what are you shooting with? What roll are you shooting? And yeah, maybe you can share some of those images with me over on Instagram. I'll put my Instagram here somewhere. I'm just out in the park here in Wuxi. I just came from the hospital getting my wife some insulin. So yeah, Lomography, Lomochrome turquoise. The name suggests that there's a turquoise shift to it or a color cast to it. I don't really know what they're doing, Lomography, what Wizardry they're doing, but it is a dramatic color shift. There are some really, really heavy color shifts, particularly in the highlights, actually particularly across the whole range. According to Lomography, warm colors will shift towards blue will shift towards gold, and greens will shift towards emerald or turquoise-ish. And I've kind of found that that's more or less accurate. Yeah, I suppose let's get at the ISO, starting things off. It's a variable ISO film, meaning you can shoot it between 100 and 400 ISO. Depending on what ISO you shoot it at, you might get a stronger or less color shift, or less of a range, I guess, of the color shift, or the strength. There we go. Less strength in the color shifts. I metered it at a 100 because I wanted to get all that extra light and extra goodness, and I was just experimenting really. And I used this app on my phone called LogMe, or Logbook, which comes along with the LightMe metering app. So it's really cool. You can actually log your settings for the shot. I mean, it's a bit extra, but if you wanted to do things where you can document what apertures, ISO, shutter speeds, and films you use, then this app does come in handy. I'll put in a side view where you can see. So I just documented a bunch of the shots that I took so that we can have a look at the strength of those color shifts and what the amount of light does to the colors and to the image. So yeah, I mean, the color shifts in my images were really strong. I think it will just a lot stronger than my Lomography purple shots. The highlights in most of my shots do come out. They did come out like a pinky peachy coral color, which I really, really like. But I noticed that the whites in the clouds particularly were still fairly whitish. They had a bit of a blue to it, but they were mostly, like, you could still see that or make out that they were white or are supposed to be white. And then the mid-tones, but more the shadow end of the mid-tones did go a little bit towards blue, emeraldy, turquoise. And then the shadows, I metered mostly for the highlights or mid-tones to try and get the contrast, because I was shooting on mostly sunny days, trying to get that natural contrast that sunlight gives you. But I metered for the mid-tones to slightly overexposing towards the highlights. Not really blowing it out, but yeah, actually that's not really, yeah, I was trying to get the highlights exposed correctly, but I didn't care so much about going over. So like, let me use my Logbook app. The shot of the building, you can see I took a photo, and this is also, I'll show it on the screen, but this is to compare, like that's a real, this is my iPhone camera that took that photo. And the same photo I took at, it's 100 ISO, f2.8, 1/60 seconds. So yeah, I overexposed, but you'll still see that the detail in the highlights is there, and also in the midtones, it's exceptional. And that's another thing that I want to say about this film is, even though I don't even know what wizardry is going on, the sharpness and the clarity of the images is still very, very strong. And I really enjoy that. I think that because I shot it in full sun, the natural contrast helps with that. But I mean, if you look in the midtones and the highlights, the sharpness of the images is very, very strong. So I really enjoyed that about this film. A little bit strong, the light there, but yeah. So I got my book here where I wrote down some of my thoughts about the film, just to try keep this flowing nicely, which so far it hasn't been working. I enjoy the color shift of this film, Lomochrome turquoise. I particularly like it for architecture. I think that's where it really stood out for me. I loved the contrast of the buildings against the sky, and how the color shifts enhanced and made those images stand out. And I think the thing is, because of the color shifts and how strong the color shifts are, the images are very unique. So they're eye-catching because it's not a color palette that you see at all, really. And it's very, very unusual and unique. So the images do stand out. But I would say that for this film, I think, in my opinion, the same thing, I think that your subjects of the images, you need to be curated. You need to know what to expect, and that's kind of why I make these. And yeah, I shot some portraits of friends, and I don't think it works very, very well for portraiture, unless that's what you're going for, the look you're going for. But what I found is that it tends to make people look very alien-like. It just doesn't look nice. I guess if you're aiming for something like that, and maybe you're setting up the scene a lot better, planning the scene better, it could look interesting and unique. But I don't think the portraits that I took, I mean, I like them, but I like them more as that's a funny way to see a person. I don't like them as like a standout image. They're not going to go on my portfolio. They're just more of that's a good friend of mine. I enjoyed that moment. I can remember that moment, and it adds a little bit of humor to that moment. It is a variable ISO film, as I've mentioned already, but that also means that the exposure latitude is pretty decent on this film. I think exposure latitude on most films are pretty decent, but these variable ISO films, it does mean that the exposure latitude is pretty strong. But also with the color shifting, you're not necessarily looking, the aim of the film is not for that incredible sharpness and clarity, even though this film is actually really sharp and has a great clarity, at least in my opinion. But it handles overexposure pretty well, I reckon. As I was saying, that with that first shot, framing the building with the full sky, a very, very bright scene, and I overexposed by quite a bit, and still got incredible detail in the midtones, and there was no clouds in the sky, so it was a straight blue sky, but there's still incredible detail in the images, even overexposed. I think underexposing, from what I've seen of this roll, underexposing, it can handle maybe a little bit, but it's better, it needs more light. They're a light hungry film, and it's better to expose perfectly to even maybe a bit over. I generally tend to overexpose all my film at least half a stop to sometimes one stop, depending on the scene, and I meter mostly for the midtones, and a little bit obviously overexposing, you often might blow out the highlights, but I found that that's not necessarily the case. But also with the color shifting, I think blown out highlights, it's not that incredibly bright white, so you don't notice it as much. It might just become like in this particular film, the overexposed blown out highlights just probably are a beautiful peachy coral color, so you don't notice the overexposure as much. But I did notice that in the shadows, particularly the deep shadows, it can tend to be muddy, and the dark shadows do go a very strong blue color. And I think there's 1 or 2 shots where I have it a little bit underexposed in the shadows, like, or not a little bit, quite a bit underexposed, and you'll see the muddiness of the underexposure. So I'm going to try and give my 4-part breakdown. I don't know if you've seen that over on my Instagram. Just kind of a basic overview of the film and my thoughts on it. Just something for you to keep on hand. You can screenshot it and save them. So yeah, exposure latitude, it's a variable ISO film. So the exposure latitude is it has a wide exposure latitude, but that's also depending on what ISO you shoot it at. I shot it at ISO 100, so trying to get in more light. And I reckon if you're shooting it at 400, that latitude might not be as strong. It might be, obviously it's a lot more sensitive to the light, so and it requires less light. So the exposure latitude in that case might not be as wide. But I would recommend overexposing rather than underexposing, as I would with most film. But I'd say you can overexpose it by maybe a stop and a half. So I gave it, for exposure latitude, I gave it 3 out of 5, where you can overexpose for about a stop and a half. Then sharpness, the color wizardry and the color shifts do tend to take away a little bit of the sharpness, I find, although that was more so in Lomo Purple and other like Kono kind of films where they've done almost like film soup type stuff. But I don't know what Lomo have done to this film. I don't know how they have shifted the colors so much, but I still find that the images are incredibly sharp. There's a great sharpness to the film, to the images, especially in the midtones and the highlights, and only really underexposed shadows will be muddy and not as sharp. So for sharpness, I gave it 4 out of 5, steak knife sharp. So be careful, it's so sharp it could cut you. And then, looking at my notes, for contrast, I shot the film primarily in bright sun, like these conditions, and that gives it a natural contrast, like you can see in my face, just with the sunlight here. Well, now it's gone, but the strong natural contrast kind of came across in the images, but the film itself has a good contrast. So I also gave it about 4 out of 5. It is a 60% contrast. It's a strong contrast, but I think that also is because I shot it in full sun. I think if you shoot it in lower light conditions, the contrast will be a lot flatter, and also the images might come across as pretty muddy. And yeah, I mean, I was shooting in full light, so the highlights, the midtones and the shadows will be quite noticeable in the images just because of that light. As you can see here, you've got highlights on the side of my face, the side's pretty deep shadows, and then behind me is mids. So it's kind of like that, I guess. Grain, I found that overexposing the film, the grain is actually quite fine. It's not all that, it doesn't break up the images really. They look beautiful. I really enjoy, I think, every image of the roll that I shot. But yeah, the grain is not so noticeable on most of my images, but then it does become pretty prominent in the underexposed shadows. And now I'm severely underexposed because the sun is disappearing. Yeah, the grain does become quite noticeable in underexposed areas. So I think I'd recommend shooting this film at 100 to maybe 200 to try and get more of the light and expose for more light, just so that you don't get the muddy shadows that I found in a few of the images. But other than that, I gave it a 2 to 3 out of 5, fine to fine medium for grain. And yeah, that's my 4-part breakdown of this film. Maybe you can check it out, follow me on Instagram and check out my stories. Yeah, so that was my 4-part breakdown of Lomochrome Turquoise. Let me know what you think of the shots. Sorry for the windiness, I'm trying to record this a little bit outside. And yeah, I'm really, really sorry for not having posted the filmstock tryouts in a while. Hopefully I have a little bit more time coming up. And if you're interested in our travels and what's life like here in China and our travels across Japan and any other travels that we're going on or have been on, maybe check out my wife and I's vlog channel. Weird, but I like it. You don't have to. I'm just putting it out there. That's not really a photography channel. It's our life and vlog thing. And we've been busy to grow that as well, but also not as consistent as we want to be. But yeah, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoy the beautiful scenery of here in Wuxi in China, and I hope you really enjoyed the photos. Catch up on Instagram or Threads. I think I prefer using Threads. It seems a little bit more interactive. Just go out, make stuff, shoot film, and have fun. See you guys.